Alright, in this video, I'm going to be going over a deadlift specific warm-up, so just another lower body warm-up, where the deadlift is going to be my main movement of the day. So I'm going to start with my self-myofascial release. Like I normally do on my lower body days, I'm going to start by rolling out my feet. Now, everything's actually feeling pretty good today. I'm feeling pretty mobile, feeling already pretty loose when I walked into the gym. So I'm going to reduce the amount of time that I spend on some self-myofascial release while I still want to hit it in order to maintain it. Maintain that tissue quality, maintain that mobility. I'm not going to spend as much time on it today because I don't need to. I'm not feeling really beat up in any sense. So I'm just going to kind of hit it quick and then move on to some more active parts of the warm-up. But again, it's still a lot easier to maintain a physical function than it is to develop it. So I still want to hit some of the foam rolling and the myofascial release, but don't need to do it as much. So the next spot that I'm going to be working on with my self-myofascial release are my hip flexors. So as you can see, I'm lying with my back against the bench. I'm digging that kettlebell right into my hip. That's a tight area from driving, sitting too much. But when that area gets tight, it actually pulls a lot on the low back. And as we know that the low back is a sensitive spot and a very commonly injured portion when performing the deadlift. And I believe that while a lot of this can be technique, your ability to generate tension, having a weak low back, one of the reasons why this might happen is that your hip flexors are actually pulling, when a muscle is tight, it actually pulls the joints that it's attached to in both directions. So your hip flexors, your psoas, and your iliopsoas, which is the muscle or the connection point that attaches right on the inside of your hip bone and goes down onto your leg. Well, the psoas actually goes up and engulfs a lot of the lumbar vertebrae. Okay, well, so that when it's tight, it'll actually pull the lumbar vertebrae towards the femur, which is the other part that it attaches, but it also pulls the femur towards the lumbar vertebrae, right? Like it pulls both joints towards each other. Well, when your back is not stacked up in a neutral alignment because of that tension, it is much more susceptible to a lower or a low back disc herniation, right? Which is something that people might do during a deadlift if they're not doing it properly. Your back is incredibly strong when it's in a neutral alignment, but when it's off center and the vertebrae aren't stacked on top of each other, that's when things can really go awry. So I want to make sure that my hip flexors aren't tight, so that they're not pulling on that my low back there to increase that or injury risk chance. So I'm decreasing that injury risk chance by performing some self-myofascial release on my hip flexors. The final spots that I'm going to be working on during my self-myofascial release portion of my warm-up are my lats, which you can see me working on right now, and then my spinal erectors, which you'll see me roll over to in a second. And then I'm going to be working on those each side. Now, your lats are super important in developing tension in the deadlift because they're the only muscle that actually connects the spine to the humerus, which is your upper arm bone. And as we know, in order to actually deadlift, you have to grab the bar with your hands, right? So your upper body tension is very important, and that's that's an area that people tend to forget about. So now I'm rolling over to my spinal erectors portion, and I'm going to roll down my low back into my low back just a little bit. So your spinal erectors are three big muscles that go right up on each side of your spinal cord, okay? When they get tight, they actually do the same thing that the hip flexors do, is they pull on the low back, or they attach to the top of the pelvis, so they'll actually pull you into a more arched position. It's called a lower crossed position. If you want to, you should feel free to look that up so you can get a better visual representation of it. But a lower cross portion is not a great position to either squat or deadlift with. So when your spinal erectors are tight, they pull on your pelvis so that the top of the pelvis starts to tilt forward, and again, that throws that back out of that neutral alignment that we were talking about with the hip flexors, which is really, really what we want to keep a neutral spine and maintain a strong position while we're deadlifting. So that's why I'm working on these two areas right now. Start loosening up the lats so that I can feel them a little bit better when I'm deadlifting in order to get them tight, and then the spinal erectors, loosen them up a little bit so that they're not pulling my pelvis out of position while I'm deadlifting. So now I'm going to be increasing the intensity a little bit. Since I'm done with my self-myofascial release, I'm going to start increasing my core body temperature. By the next thing I'm going to be doing are banded good mornings. So this does a couple things for me. First, it starts to warm up my glutes, my hamstrings, my back, my low back, and my spinal erectors. My upper back a little bit because this is a motion that works those areas, but also it's going to help me practice my hip hinging motion, which you can see is that sitting, keeping your legs relatively straight and sitting back into your hips. That's a super important position for the deadlift because that's kind of the how you set up in the deadlift. That's also the the finish portion in the deadlift, and that helps load your glutes and hamstrings and back more so that you're not just using your quads kind of in either a deadlift or a squatting motion also. But this hip hinge motion is something that a lot of people struggle with. They either just round their back over, or they can only squat down. So being able to perform a hip hinge motion is really, really important. It's actually so important that it's one of the fundamental movement patterns that a lot of our programs are based around, and a lot of exercises are based around, but you need a lot of practice in order to actually be good at it. So I'm using this to get more practice. The next mobility exercise that I'm going to be doing is a quad hip flexor rock. So you can see me reaching for that back leg. I'm working on trying to push my hip forward and squeezing my butt and maintaining a nice neutral alignment from my head all the way down towards my leg. So this is starting to or mobilize that hip flexor a little bit more also, but now I'm starting to add a little bit of motion into it as opposed to just the self-myofascial release when I was just massaging it out. So now I'm starting to add a little bit more movement, a little bit more tension by trying to squeeze my butt. So I'm continuing opening up that hip flexor, but now through a little bit more range of motion. The next thing that I'm going to, or the next movement that I'm going to be doing is a single leg deadlift. So again, kind of just using this as a warm-up. I'm using this as movement practice. So I'm practicing the movement of the hip hinge, but now I'm adding a little bit of increased difficulty by performing it on one leg. So there's a much higher stability component to this, okay? Well, again, so when you're more stable in an exercise, you have a higher ability to produce more force, okay? Because your body doesn't, your body will basically down-regulate the amount of force that you can output if you are unstable, because it doesn't want you to get hurt. So we add a bunch of things, or we work on a bunch of exercises in order to increase our ability to be stable within a movement, so our body can actually produce more force in that movement. Think it's kind of like the brakes and steering in your car. If you have a car with a lot of horsepower, you're going to need a lot or very heavy-duty brakes and heavy-duty steering in order to still control that car. So my next exercise that I'm going to be doing is single leg glute bridge. So again, a very basic movement. I'm actually very stable in this movement. So it's kind of almost the opposite of the single leg deadlift that you were just doing, or just watching me do. Because my back is against the floor is helping me be stable. But what that does is it helps me focus on my glutes and hamstrings a little bit more in that hip extension motion. So again, in my warm-up, just continuing to use this to get a little bit more blood into that area. It's a little bit harder than the double leg version, so I'm trying to increase that intensity of that hip hinging pattern where like I was doing before with the good mornings, but now I'm getting a little bit more intense because it's a single leg version. The next two movements that I'm going to be performing kind of hit the same thing, just in two different ways. This first one that you see here is called a fire hydrant, and then the next one that you're going to see is an all fours hip car, okay? So what I'm working on is just maintaining a neutral posture, or maintaining core tension, while I'm performing some motion at my hips. So here you can just see me lifting out to the side like I'm peeing on a fire hydrant, and I'm squeezing my butt. This next one, I'm going to be performing more of a full circle with my hips, but again, I'm still trying not to rotate at my low back and maintain good ab tension, but allowing my hips to actually perform the movement. Again, this is something we want to practice in the deadlift. We want to get the majority of our power from our hips. A lot of people who aren't good at the hip hinging pattern actually get the majority of their power from their back and from their low back. And while this may work for a little bit, over time that can start to wear out the discs and the joint integrity of your back. So we want to learn how to get more power out of our hips. And this is just a drill and a warm-up drill that'll help me practice that, maintaining tension in my core while actually getting the motion from my hips and my lower body. All right, getting more towards the end of my warm-up here. This is my CNS intense activity for the warm-up. So I'm practicing now an explosive hip hinge, and one of the best ways to do that is with a kettlebell swing. As you can see, I'm not really using my quads or bending my knees really at all. So all of that motion is coming from my hips and my back. And again, I want the majority of that power coming from my hips. So this is now a way to practice that hip hinging pattern, that fundamental movement pattern, but through an explosive movement. So the kettlebell swing is actually a pretty advanced movement that people don't really take into consideration. But whenever you start to add speed to a movement, you increase the level of difficulty of movement proficiency. So you start to increase that technical breakdown as you add speed. So you really need to be sound with the hip hinge pattern before you start to add speed to it. Now I'm going to be starting to get a little bit more movement practice in. I'm just going to be performing 2 sets of 10 RDLs just with the bar. Again, I'm slowly starting to increase the range of motion where I'm performing the hip hinge actually with a barbell. So the RDL, or Romanian deadlift, is a normal deadlift, but just the top portion. That really hits the glutes and the hamstrings in that their ability to extend the hip or push those hips forward or push that leg out behind your hip like we've been doing in the hip hinging pattern. So you're going to see me performing the 2 sets of RDLs here and then actually move to the barbell to perform normal deadlifts after this because that increases the range of motion. So I'm gradually increasing the range of motion, therefore kind of increasing the intensity as I continue to progress through this warm-up. So you saw me start with the good mornings, which was kind of the lower intensity hip hinging patterns. Then I was going to single leg versions, then a glute bridge on the floor, but a single leg version, which is a little bit more intense because I only have one leg working. Then I went to a speed version of the hip hinge, which is the most intense because that's the hardest to keep your technical form in. But now I'm starting to actually touch the barbell and make it more specific towards what I'm going to be performing, or the lift I'm going to be performing the day. So that's just kind of my progression of it. There's a lot of ways that you can do it, but that's just kind of my justification of it. So now the last thing that I'm going to be doing is performing my sets on the deadlift the exact way that I'm going to be doing it in my workout. So my practice for today is literally just going to be doing a conventional deadlift for 1 rep. I normally actually don't do anything more than 1 rep. Sometimes I'll do sets of 5, but Pat really only has me do sets of 1 on the deadlift there. So that's exactly what I'm going to be practicing. I'm trying to feel my form, make sure everything's tight. I'm practicing like it's really, really heavy, so I'm still setting my feet. I'm setting my hands. You can see me lifting my hips there in order to take a really, really big breath, and then setting tight, and then trying to explode up. So again, just really increasing that intensity of the warm-up and practicing the reps exactly how I want them to look when I'm at my heavy sets there. If you start to treat your light weights like they're heavy weights, in the form that you're setting up exactly the same and you're treating them like they're heavy, then you have a much higher chance of having your heavy lifts look a lot more sound or more technically proficient, because you have all of these good reps underneath your belt that you might not have had before if you just kind of went through the motions on your lifts, not paying attention.